just for your like essay, like situational awareness, like from here on will be recorded if that's all good.
Yeah, that's fine, mate.
Awesome. Well, mate, look, thanks firstly for chatting to me. I know you and a couple of other guys in your sort of immediate group reached out to me to make this happen. And for those listening at home, we have had to hide your identity, both your voice and face, for the purpose of this interview, just due to problems in both the Western government and, I guess, continuing support with the Ukrainian government. But I just really want to get your background of how you ended up in Ukraine and what you're doing.
Yeah, right. So I'm effectively my background is military. The group I'm working with is officially aid related, but we are doing a lot of work around the Bakhmut area, as well as other parts of the front. At the moment, my previous military background, former Australian Army and former French Army. So I'm at the moment working with a team of people who at this point are trying to effectively do what we can to help out Ukraine. There really isn't, I think a lot of us are quite angry at what the Australian government has been doing or the lack of action in many cases. And so, yeah, we're out here trying to help. Officially, again, I do extra work on top of that. I also do extra training and other things. And in that time, I've had the chance to see what and others in my group have seen what's sort of really going on here. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that does. Look, let's just jump in the deep end. I guess, what is it that I guess is not being portrayed in the media or on social media that is happening there that you are seeing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of copium. There's a lot of ideas that the Russians are idiots and all of this, and there's a lot of truth to it. But the reality is Wagner has been for a long time relatively near peer. There's a lot of issues with Wagner, but the fact is that the simple reality is that Ukraine is broadly losing this war. The objective of Wagner is to basically attrit the Ukrainian army to the point where they cannot conduct operational offensives and to obviously capture more and more territory and demoralize the Ukrainians. If Ukraine can't, Ukraine's war aims are territorial integrity. If they can't achieve those war aims, then effectively Ukraine has lost. And not only is Ukraine lost, but the West has lost. That would mean that, might effectively makes right again. It means that effectively you can invade a country and you will be able to keep part of that territory, which will be a very bad thing for the West. So, yeah, that definitely I don't think is in the media. I think, in fact, the media have been particularly unhelpful, particularly Australian media. We've had general after general at the beginning of this war said, Ukraine was going to collapse in 72 hours and that it's up to the Ukrainians. And then, that suddenly changed to Ukrainians are supermen and they can win the war all by themselves. And the reality is it's never true. So, yeah, there's many things. And there's obviously the reality of the front, which isn't, I think, being fully portrayed. So the 24th, who we've worked with quite a bit, along with other groups, the 24th in particular, 24th Brigade, is massively under-equipped. It's total capability overmatch. Wagner have Blue Force tracking drones, artillery, integrated combined arms attacks. They have numerical superiority, which means they can attrit the Ukrainians. They have infiltration teams. They have the cutting off Ukrainian positions quite effectively. Effectively the Ukrainians, they don't, in many cases, don't even have MVGs in some cases. Like, we're looking at, like, without getting into the secret sauce of what we're doing, like, we're trying to help them fight without NFE. And yeah, so that's, to answer your question, that's probably one of the many things that isn't being covered.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of talking points, I guess, in that. And I guess one of the big ones is, a lot of people are portraying Wagner Group as being, conscripts from jails and, being thrown in human waves for the lack of caring of human life, just at the problem, just throwing bodies at this without training or equipment or whatever. But you say, someone on the ground who's been there doing it, that they are a near peer to, I guess, Western forces, and a match.
Yeah, so it is somewhat true. So they do use a lot of conscripts. So, but two things are right at the same time. So Wagner themselves have taken very few casualties from what we've been able to tell. And they generally do infiltration attacks. They will use what they call their fresh meat. That's what they call their first echelon. Those are conscripts. And they will send them into the attack. It isn't just human wave. They use a whole bunch of things. So that generally the way an attack will go in is they will use drones to try and spot enemy weak points. They'll concentrate their forces along a very short area of the front. They'll hit it with artillery, and the Russians in general have artillery overmatch, despite having inferior artillery, because they have better ISR. So they have Orlan integrated into their individual batteries, whereas Ukraine does not do that. I mean, in general, it's unit by unit, but in general, the Russians have been better at that mission. So they usually will smash it with artillery. Then they'll hit it with, 30 mic, 40 mic, grenade launchers, mortars. And by the time that first wave's gone over, effectively the Ukrainians unfortunately don't rotate their forces, so they're just overwhelmed and they are able to sort of break through the enemy positions. And they have about 7 different assault groups that will go through. They have every soldier has Blue Force tracking, so they have all of those conscripts they know exactly where they are. By contrast, Ukraine uses flags, and potentially panel markers. They don't even have IR tabs. It's so it is in many ways it is almost total capability overmatch. So there is truth to the fact Wagner are incredibly ruthless, and they are total dickbags, to be honest. And but the reality is that they are very much pretty near peer.
Yeah, right. And I guess with that though, with having Wagner being near peer, having Overmatch both as your intel, surveillance, reconnaissance, why are we not seeing Wagner get big gains on the front? Like we're seeing the front line around Bakhmut, at least in my opinion, if you look at the maps, we're seeing that grind forward, but just absolutely on a slow grind. I guess with this, why aren't we seeing those big jumps? Like we said in the beginning that, people assumed that Ukraine would fall in 72 hours. And with, this information, I can't help but think, why aren't we seeing just a complete, surround quickly and taking of a small city like Bakhmut?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. So that's one of the core issues, I think, with both militaries, but particularly the Russians as well, and Wagner included, is that they have an issue with operational planning. So they're creating effectively tactical salients, right? And these small tactical salients, they are actually advancing the front very slowly. Things are looking rather dire at the moment. So at the moment, as I'm sure you're probably aware, there's, it looks like from what I've heard, that the part of the secondary Ukrainian defense line has actually been breached by Wagner. And there's, Konstantinivka is under threat. Bakhmut itself only has one MSR going into it. So Wagner have been able to advance the their line very slowly, but they're quite tactically adept, is basically the answer to your question. But operationally, they're very limited. And they're limited by geography and they're limited by manpower. The Russians have made a lot of mistakes in this war because they haven't used force concentration. They haven't, developed a Schwerpunkt. So instead of attacking, what they could have done in the war, which is from the north and the south, and try and seal off Ukraine from the rest of Europe, they attacked on all these different fronts. And of course, that means that you have, your forces are dispersed. So when you meet enemy resistance, you have less reserves. Less reserves means that you can't take as much area, basically. But you're right. I mean, the Wagner have struggled until very recently to achieve any kind of operational encirclement. So yeah, that would be my assessment.
Yeah. And what is the situation currently like in somewhere like Bakhmut? Are we going to see Bakhmut fall?
It's looking almost very, very likely that will be the case, if not worse. So they, at this point, have effectively one MSR. The two MSRs, one in the north and the south, have been cut off.
Just so unless an MSR is a main service route?
Main supply route.
Main supply route, yeah.
Yeah. No, I thought it was, no, so it's just Army wank speak, mate. It's
yeah.
But yeah, so they've cut those, by cutting those two off. I mean, effectively, once they're cut off, it's like Mariupol. It'll just be a matter of time, unless Ukraine counterattacks. Unfortunately, Ukraine has been very bad at counterattacking, and that comes down to a lot of corruption and issues in the command structure of Ukrainian system, and also issues in the West too. So, yes.
When we talk though that Ukraine hasn't been effective on the counteroffensive, what about in Kharkiv and Kherson, where the counteroffensives have made large bounds and large pieces of ground?
So I don't rate those particularly. Again, the same problem applies to Ukraine as it applies to Russia. So those offensives, from what I saw, if you're looking at Kherson, I mean, effectively, almost 90% of VDV were allowed to disengage,
yes.
And they were able to save most of their reserves. So that is a massive problem, and that showed to me that the ability for the Ukrainians to they could have attacked and sealed them off. If those forces had been lost, I mean, that would have reduced the length of this war, I think, quite drastically. The Ukrainians in general have been very bad at a tactical level at the pursuit. So just harassing and following the enemy. Effectively, that's something that Ukraine has really struggled with. And we saw that in Kherson. In Kharkiv, effectively, that was at a point where the Russians were, very much spent in many ways. And they had expended, most of their reserves, and the force, and Ukrainians did find their Schwerpunkt. They found their center of gravity. They found their point of weakness in the Russian lines, and they attacked it. And that collapse allowed for a wider Ukrainian advance. However, the Ukrainians actually messed up because they focused very heavily. If you watch the advance, they had, instead of maintaining economy of force and reducing their frontage, they tried to retake pretty much everything up to the border. Whereas if they concentrated forces and made every effort to get to Severodonetsk, and there were units that were basically there, that had got across the river, they had developed a bridgehead, Ukrainian reconnaissance units, and unfortunately they got bogged down. And it's an issue of logistics and other things, but they got stuck on the river, and then the Russian conscripts came in. And by the time those forces had come in, the force ratios had changed back to essentially sort of even, almost moving into Russia's favor. So the Ukrainians, unfortunately, weren't able to capture Severodonetsk, which is the center of gravity. So from a very sort of operational, so just for your viewers at home, there's 3 levels to most wars, strategic, operational, and operational effects, can shape strategic and vice versa. And, the operational center of gravities in this war, might be Mariupol and Severodonetsk. If you retake Severodonetsk, you have an ability to you have effectively like a fort. You can effectively use that to, if you link those two up, you can retake a big chunk of Ukraine. So that's of course a very hard way to do it, but that's what Ukraine, to some degree, is still aiming for. It's just unfortunately, in the operational offensive, both sides I think have been very, very bad. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that answers it. I guess, to the degree of, I think it's very truthful to say both sides in this war, especially the Russians, have had just a horrible offensive. It was meant to be over in 48, 72 hours, and we're 340 days in or something now. With, the overmatch of the Russians should have been dramatic. The Russian air superiority should have been there. The naval superiority should have been there. And it's just seemingly not, at least from where I'm sitting.
No, it is, and there's a lot of issues as to why that happens. They don't have the seed and deed missions that we have. They don't have a lot of the they don't train for the things we train for in Western militaries, and particularly, I think one of the biggest problems is that they have consistently been attacking Ukrainian centers of gravity, cities. Which we're very lucky because the VDV were literally driving through towns and cities, which is possibly the dumbest thing you could do when the enemy is just has hundreds of ATGMs. So yes, we have been very lucky. However, what's happening in Bakhmut is Wagner figured out, like, hey, we can actually maneuver. We can, if we avoid the cities for the most part, and just focus on the tactical side, we can slowly start grinding the Ukraine back. And again, the purpose of that is mainly to attrit Ukraine, because Ukraine has a lower population than Russia does. So at a certain point, they lose so many people. And of course, this makes any offensive operation harder if you're losing your reserves. So,
yeah. Could you, I guess, give us some idea of the casualties in Bakhmut? Because I'm hearing that Wagner and the Russians are taking thousands, if not tens of thousands, but that's through just random sources. And as far as Ukrainians, I'm hearing similar in some areas and very little on other areas. I just don't know. Can you give us an idea of that?
So effectively, Wagner has taken, their actual infiltration groups have taken exceedingly few casualties. They are very much, and that's why you can see them conducting, these tactical salients. They're not coming out of thin air. They've got the reserves. They're there. I think they are taking quite a few casualties, but it is their fresh meat. It is their guys, because the first echelon is there to basically expose enemy fire. Like, where is the enemy positions, and then destroy them. Yeah. So Ukraine, on the other hand, is taking way too many casualties. The 24th, almost 80%, what I've been told by my medic down there, is almost the entire brigade has been wiped out and reconstituted. And that's why we're seeing, as viewers at home need to understand that, some of these guys are going straight from Thankyou, recruitment centers to the front in some cases, and they're getting at most like 2 weeks training. So, it's bad.
Yeah, so these Ukrainian blokes are getting a couple of weeks of training and then just on to the fiercest frontline we've seen, I guess, since World War II Korea.
Yep, 100%. And they're being put into offensive operations in many cases. They're not even being put into defensive positions. They're being put into like company attacks, which is
a lot of moving parts. For those who haven't done a company attack, you've got so many moving parts. It takes a trained infantry battalion in Australia all year to build up to that company battalion size attack. You start from individual soldier to groups to pairs to groups to sections, platoons. That's a very complex thing to do in any army. And if you're in, if you're in, only in recruitment training for a couple of weeks, that's unbelievable. But is there any way you could give us a ballpark figure of? I know the German intelligence service said that there's triple figure casualties of Ukraine every day there. But is there any way you could give us maybe a figure of what you think it could be?
I can't. So I guess you're looking at about a brigade is about what, almost 5,000 people. So 80% of that. That's about the number that we're looking at. It is heavy casualties. Yeah, and then you're seeing that on the map. You're seeing that effectively Ukraine is having to withdraw because they're so heavily attrited. So, I'm not. I've got my little ant's eye view of the world. I don't. Oryx is probably the best place to go for numbers, but those are the numbers that I'm seeing on my little patch of dirt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And can you talk to us about some of this Wagner equipment? I've been hearing things that they've been seeing things on Wagner soldiers that they've captured that are very high-tech equipment, and equipment that, I didn't, the Australian military, is one of the best equipped small militaries in the world, if not the best at the local, infantry level. And there's equipment we're seeing that is super high end as far as, almost like an IR tag on a helmet that is can pick up lasers and, blue force and all this sort of stuff. Can you talk to us about any of that?
Yep, 100%. So as I said before, they have all their infiltration groups have MVG. They're targeting logistics points, which in many cases on both sides have been, civilian vehicles, because it's all sort of ramshackled. Because a lot of soldiers just aren't getting equipped in many cases. MVG, integrated thermal, drones, like basically blue force tracking, radar systems, ISR systems. They have integrated DGI. There's actually a DGI team integrated with Wagner. They have everything. They have the great, you're pretty much and they don't pay for it. It's not like with the Ukrainians where, there's groups behind the front who bring basically the kit that the army won't give them. They have it all. It is. They've got they have all kinds of SIGINT capabilities. They're able to track people's phones. If you get a Western SIM card of the Russians, generally track those. It's jamming. So many things. So many things they can do. Yeah.
And you mentioned a DJI team behind their lines. Well, DJI, the drone company, that's a Chinese company, so it'd be a Chinese team helping the Russian private contractors, private mercenaries.
Yep, they're there. Yep, they literally get the latest and greatest from DJI. Which is concerning. But it is a wider trend that we're seeing from more greater integration between the Chinese and Russian militaries in general. But Wagner gets the latest and greatest.
Yeah, and I guess that's something we haven't really seen that much, at least through my eyes, on the front line, is really capable, competent Russian soldiers doing operations. Like, I know that people might say that that's, me putting my pro-Ukraine hat on, but it just, it just seems the competence level we've seen is not what we expected. But I guess this is telling another story that maybe these guys are somewhere else.
It's a unit by unit thing. I mean, it's the same in every military. Some units are real crash hot, some are terrible.
Yeah,
I mean, on both sides. Yeah, right. Yeah, no comment. It is unit by unit. I mean, VDV, certain FSB units are, better. Wagner are generally better. On the Ukraine side, you have the 95th Airborne. You have a lot of, I think, was it 10th Motorized, which is they're recreating like Generation Kill. There's really good units out there. I mean, unfortunately, it is basic, but broadly, with the exception of Wagner, it is just two big Soviet armies smashing into each other. It just doesn't, unless they have the numbers, unless they have, huge shock armies, which they don't, neither side has, then they basically, it just becomes gridlocked because the Soviet system is very different to the Western system. In the sense that they don't have, and so this explains a lot of the issues that we're seeing on the Ukrainian side too. They don't have like, like a, what do you call it? Like a staff, like a command staff.
Mhm.
Like usually at the battle group level, at least the battle group level in the Western military, you have like, your S1, S2, you have your logistics guys, you have your intel guys, and their job is to advise the commander. In the Soviet system, they just have one bloke, and he effectively is trained in what's known as the CFON, which is the correlation of force and means, which is a logarithmic scale that can basically tell you if you're going to win in a certain area. Which, again, there's lots of issues with this, as you can imagine, and it means that initiative effectively is taken away from the lower level, and it's generally decision making is more centralized, with the exception of course, Wagner, who are actually even doing company team level attacks. So yeah, that's probably why you're seeing it's obviously unit by unit. Some units in the Ukrainian army are terrible. Units in the Russian army are terrible. It's a real mixed bag.
Yeah. And can you talk to us about, I guess, you mentioned earlier on about the Australian government and what they could be doing to support but aren't doing, if that's along the right lines?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot. So a lot of the corruption that we're seeing in Ukraine, the Australian government and I think other governments around the world could absolutely be doing more to deal with this, because it's actually quite, yeah. So I'll give you an example. So that command staff that I just mentioned, the Australian government could very easily, send advisors, military attaches, and say, "Hey, look, we're going to give you this assistance. In return, we need some degree of accountability on the battlefield." At the moment, the way that it operates is very similar. I wouldn't say similar to Afghan, but there's a similar problem where, in the case of Ukraine, we've given them, for example, M777s, right? We gave them a bunch of M777s, but we haven't given them the drones to spot the targets, right? And again, like there's also no accountability. So we're training guys up on these systems, but there's no accountability if the system is actually destroyed. It's just sort of covered up or not covered at all in many cases by the Australian government. And so that creates a real big problem where effectively poor conduct is allowed to continue. And it's interesting because my previous career in the Australian Army, I experienced a very similar thing in the Australian Army itself, which was the issue of corruption. And effectively, long story short, I've been to the Royal Commission about this, and I've talked about how the Australian government in particular needs more effective mechanisms to deal with corruption within its own system. In my case, one example in the Australian Army is that the Australian Army was, when they were initially handing out the EF-88, it's actually, we had issues with the bolts exploding. Now, effectively, the Australian government just did everything it could to cover it. Situations like that, and situations like I'm talking about here in Ukraine, where commanders are making people do company attacks for no reason, frontal attacks, and they're getting wiped out by Russian artillery. There has to be some system that allows you to get rid of that commander, right? And that could be done through integrated command staffs. It could be done through an independent corruption mechanism that applies to all of Europe or the West or Ukraine or whatever. Because at this point, we are providing like assistance, but it's just not going to the right place. And it is in Australia's interest to make sure that we win. So, as I said, the issue is that Australian sort of military corruption, as is unfortunately feeding into Ukrainian military corruption, and there just isn't enough accountability, right? So just like in Afghanistan, no one got fired, no one lost their job. There's no real look at, hey, how can we do things differently? It was just make the problem go away. Don't talk about it. Shut up. We evacuated a bunch of people. Shush, go away. Next problem. And I feel unfortunately that is largely what is happening in Ukraine. is, and I saw it at the beginning of the war where people were like, oh, well, it's up to Ukraine to see if they're going to win. And I just don't see it that way. My view, I mean, I'll give another example, like the PMVs, when they got sent over to Ukraine, had no remote weapon systems at all, no remote weapons tower, no active protection system, no smoke launchers. I was like, would we send an Australian soldier with that system? What would the Australian public say about that? Like, curious. And the reality is the Australian government just thinks it can get away with doing that. And it's not just one, it's not like the current government. This has been both governments, and it's a problem within the wider Australian military. And unfortunately, it is resulting in what we're seeing on the ground where, you know, we have Ukrainian commanders who basically just don't listen to the training teams that are here. And there's nothing we can really do about it. And people just get killed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
But a lot of the equipment being sent, and I've seen this with the tanks recently, it's for political points. It's not for a Ukrainian victory, in my opinion. That, you know, you're looking at 12 or 14 Challenger 2 tanks from the UK. That's political points and nice headlines. That's not for a win. If you wanted to win, you'd give them 200. Same with the HIMARS, same with the M777s. And that's my problem with this, is the corruption's there, of course, but are we trying to have Ukraine win, or are we trying to get political brownie points and give some equipment to maybe hold them off? Is that a fair enough opinion, I guess, or am I incorrect?
I would say that that's been true up to, yeah, I'd say broadly there's a lot of truth to that. I think, yeah, this is, you know, Sun Tzu says, you know, never mix politics and war. You know, like, the military, in my view, should be accountable for this, and there should be real questions at the moment about, you know, what the hell is Angus Camp? What is the Australian military attaché in Ukraine doing? And we're not asking those questions. And I think you're right. I think it is that this, unfortunately, militaries around the world have become, you know, beholden to sort of these political dreams, and these tanks that are being brought forward. I mean, at this point, effectively, the reason the Bradleys and the tanks are all being brought in is basically all the things that I've just said is a sort of secret acknowledgement that things aren't going well, and that Ukraine needs to be able to start engaging in an operational offensive. Otherwise, the consequences of losing will affect the West. So I think behind the scenes there has been some change, which is good. The problem is, as you said, it's not really enough, and it's not what is necessarily needed. And this leads back into sort of Western military corruption feeding into Ukrainian, because the tanks that are being proposed, as you said, there's not enough of them. It's the same with the IFVs. We need more. Now, the reality is that hopefully the idea is that more countries chip in, and then, you know, we'll have about 100 or 200 tanks if the Leopard 2s get sent. The problem is, though, is that the fighting in Bakhmut is largely assault guns. I mean, that's what we need. We need assault guns. This is an artillery war. That's all we're going up against. So while these are great tanks, we're going to have to be able to logistically integrate them into Ukraine. We're going to have to train the Ukrainians up. And we've just waited to the last minute to do this.
Yeah.
All this stuff should have been happening like back in 2014, to be honest. I mean, if we want to be truly, but you know, unfortunately, yeah, as you said, there is a certain veneer of political point making. I think in particular what I've been advocating for is really more automated systems. So Wagner, you know, have a numerical advantage, and they're using meat. It's you know, to try and attrit the Ukrainians. And what we need is better tactics and better meta. So the Ukrainians have to become more efficient. They can't take as many casualties. And one of the ways to reduce casualties is to give them, you know, automated systems, to give them automated, you know, UGVs, UCAV, and, you know, help them stabilize the front that way so that less Ukrainian soldiers are dying. And then that, you know, then allows us to attrit the Russians and then think about operational offensives. Unfortunately, my concern is that the stuff that we are sending, if you send a Bradley, and hopefully the guys get trained up on it, I hope they do. And I think that there is some evidence that that's happening. But if you just have an idiot commander who does another frontal attack and just sends them in and they all get destroyed, by Russian artillery, like, what was the point of that?
Yeah.
So it is, this war is not going, I think, as well as people maybe realize. It's going very badly for Russia too, but the fact is the Russians only need Novorossiya. They just need some part of Ukraine, and they need to humiliate the West. That's their two big objectives of this war. And so far, they are somewhat achieving them. And I can tell people that, Chinese war planners and war planners around the world are looking at what is happening in Ukraine, and they are developing, they're looking at, hey, mate, can we get away with this? What are the outcomes of this war,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, what would you do if you were, the power to be, you were the prime minister or president somewhere? What would be your steps? Well, would it be more artillery, more tanks, more training, or do we not have time for that?
We got to try.
Yeah.
We do have time. So the first thing that we can do, and I've been screaming from the rafters about getting it, the quickest way to win this war right now and to make it hard, give Russia the biggest headache they can, is to drop smart mines and cluster munitions across the entire border with Ukraine and Russia. Blocking those Russian MSRs, right? Because that's how wars are won and lost. It's logistics. If we can either disrupt or even block those MSRs, the ability for the Russians to maintain positions in Ukraine becomes untenable, effectively, because they can't resupply them. The next thing is stabilizing the front. So as I said, UGVs and UCAV, that's the two biggest things that they desperately need, because those things allow you to basically feel out the enemy, find where the enemy's position are, like Wagner are doing, without the loss of human life. And it keeps people alive. It allows the guy on the ground to react more effectively and allows him to survive. The next thing as well I would also probably add that, they really need more bunkers. They need better defensive lines, better defensive works, because what's happening is, effectively the Russians are able to break through their existing defensive positions. Look, that's the equipment side. I mean, obviously there's all kinds of things as well, like, planes and stuff, but that's just, it's not gonna happen. There's a lot of reasons why it's not gonna happen. But the next is the organizational. And if I was the prime minister, I would have sent in at least a training team with all those M777s, all in country. And I would have said, and a lot of ways you can do this, but having those Ukrainian soldiers integrated into even Australian Army units and having them fully trained so they understand the combined arms mission. They understand how to do a company level attack, and they have these Australian advisors in their units. So if you have an idiot commander who's going to potentially jeopardize the front, there's some sort of mechanism to prevent that from happening. So that's what I would have done, is not just like give M777s across, this is the Australian part of the front, right? Just like we did in Vietnam, right? Pukui province, that's our province, right? This is how we run it. We have an Australian officer in charge, and he is accountable for what happens on this front. So that's how I would probably do that. Yeah.
Where do you see the front line, especially around, I guess, Bakhmut, because that's more your specialty area? Where do you see that going in the coming weeks?
There's a number of, I think as Michael Kaufman said, war is contingent. There's a number of, options. So if the Ukrainians can counterattack and get back their MSRs, they can hold it. If they can hold just one MSR, they can hold Bakhmut until they can't. Basically, if the Russians achieve another tactical salient, which it looks like that may happen, then Bakhmut is then isolated. Potentially could face encirclement, but even isolation is enough to starve the defenders. And yeah, then Bakhmut falls. I think as well, it's not just Bakhmut, because of course the southern, Bakhmut formed an initial defense line, but the secondary defense line is also breached. So it's really what happens after Bakhmut falls. So this means that Ukraine now has to, create a new defense line, potentially from Cram to Konstantinivka or somewhere in between. And to do that, they're going to need bunkers. They're going to need, they're going to have to start that now. And unfortunately, so far, Ukrainian defensive works have not been really up to what we need them to be. So losing that secondary defense line, not a part of it, is very, very concerning. So the worst case, absolute worst case, is Ukraine has taken so many attritional casualties that when they withdraw to their tertiary defense line, it just turns into a rout. And then the line, the Donbass front collapses.
Right.
And Wagner just, that's very much worst case. I hope that doesn't happen, but morale is just so bad at the moment. It's so bad at the moment. Like literally talking about these company teams, I'm literally hearing other trainers, guys say like, look, if you get an idiot company commander, think about fragging it. Think about just fucking, like, we can't have guys who do, and literally doing things like the Heinz Guderian is doing, just turn off your radios and get one company talking to another company and vice versa, and just setting up little spare parts units, and having them support different areas of that's the level that we're at, because a lot of the ATG, like there were guys I was working with, and they were showing me videos how they had just been completely isolated, and they were surrounded by Russian tanks, and they had no ATGMs.
Yeah. Because
the brigade commanders generally have all the jabs and all the equipment, and that's where a lot of it is really falling apart. And look, the guys here are trying to do what they can. They're trying to, give these guys, more sort of tools from their toolkit, more tactics, more stuff we can give. There's lots of little things we can do, and the guys on the ground are great. A lot of them are really professional. They fucking really want to learn. They want to do things differently. They want to survive, but unfortunately, their commanders are, it's not all of them, but yeah, the vast majority are not up to, and not up to scratch, and they're not equipped. So yeah.
Yeah. And have you seen much of, I guess, Psyops happening from the Ukrainians?
Yeah, they're extremely ineffective. I think on both sides, they're relatively ineffective. They both suck at it quite, because you can just, an effective Psyop would result in troops just leaving their trenches and giving up. I shouldn't say that. There have been good ones. There have been a few instances where like Conscripts and stuff have surrendered, but generally both sides drop like leaflets on each other, and they're not really effective. They just become effectively toilet paper. There is, I think, and it's not just a problem in Ukraine. I think the West really struggles. I think psychological operations is something that, most countries struggle with, because psychology itself is it's a very new science. And I think, unfortunately, the military has been using psychology for a long time as a sort of pseudoscience. Like, it's just, there's limitations to what you can do with it. There's things I've recommended for psychological operations, which I can't get into, but they just don't happen, basically. They just drop, there's lots of things. They dropped leaflets. Wagner generally just tried to scare the shit out of people. effectively, they'll hunt you down on Telegram and stuff, and they'll find out your family, and it's just a pretty standard sort of Russian tactic.
Yeah. And what do you think the odds are, or the situation would be, if there is a second front line open, or another front line, I should say, open, Belarus to Kiev? Because that's, to me, looking very possible.
I think it comes down to those force ratios. I mean, as I've said, it is becoming more likely. I've been very skeptical of that until somewhat recently, because people have just sort of been saying that. I think it's honestly a Russian diversion. And I think that's pretty, I think to a degree it has been. The problem is, so the Russians need about another, I'd say about 300 to 400,000 troops to conduct that operation, because effectively Belarus only has, on paper, about almost a core sized element, and even then that's supposed to be fighting, with Russian military. So they just don't have, and then like it also doesn't make sense, because they're moving stuff out of Belarus. So if you wanted to maintain an offensive, you probably want to build up forces there. So, I mean, and then, of course, it's the same thing like before this war began. Like, we need to see them moving to their assembly points. We need to see them moving to their FETs. We need to see them, well, they don't really do that, but, we need to see them, sort of having that on the ground build up. And if you do have that force ratio, where you outnumber Ukrainians, then yeah. And it also depends on where they're going to attack. They're going to try and take Kiev again, because Kiev is heavily defended. Are they going to try and take Lviv? Because Lviv, while isn't hugely defended, I mean, it's just like the heartland of Ukrainian resistance. I mean, every cat and his dog's going to fight you there. Yeah, so, I mean, at this point, all they can really do is a raid, I think. I don't know if you remember about the 95th raid back in 2014. I mean, that's potentially something they could do. But actually, like, taking and holding ground, I think they're going to need those previous numbers for that. It would be, of course, if it did happen, it would be very disruptive, because Ukraine has committed, a good chunk of its reserves to this fight in Bakhmut. So they don't really have many reserves for an operational offensive.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was my thinking, is there's so many guys down that east, a couple of day drive, that if they did an attack from the north, north to south into Kiev or somewhere like that, the actual ability of Ukraine to move guys to defend or be in an offensive would be very limited. That was at least my thought process behind it.
Yeah, I think to some degree they have some reserves, but like, yeah, it potentially, it is something they could do. To be honest, it's something they should have done at the beginning of the war. If the Russians had any brains, they would have, concentrated forces in Belarus, concentrated forces in the south, which is where they had their success. And of course, the Ukrainian defensive lines of the Dnipro, not just Dnipro, outside of Crimea, collapsed within 24 hours, total collapse. So, yes, but unfortunately, they didn't do it. And I think the problem with this, of course, is it would just be another front. And the Russians also have to deal with the front that they're fighting on currently. Because the Russians are, while I'm saying, like, Wagner are taking, much less casualties than the Ukrainians, which is true, they are taking casualties. And there's only so many of those they can take before they then have to do another, which they are already doing, another call-up, effectively, which is already happening, but yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting that they're doing another call-up. Like, I thought the Russian military was, 500,000 man strong with a few million in reserve, and, they're doing these conscription call-ups. It just seems interesting that it's not as large as I guess we thought.
Oh, so it is. So that's all there. So those million numbers, those are actually the Those are like their chocos. So so when you leave, so the way it works in the Russians and the Soviet system to a lesser degree is that you serve in the Russian army, for 2 years or so, then you leave, and then you become part of that sort of million-man body. And then what they do is they go through, depending on how soon you left, they call you up back into service.
Yeah.
So that's how it works, right? So so those million men, they're kind of going through that at the moment. That's what they're chewing through. The actual Russian army is about 100,000 so-called professional forces, plus Wagner as well. So So
it's a difficult one, especially if you're talking. I have no idea what the Russian casualties are. I know they like to throw around 115,000 people, but that's a big chunk, isn't it?
That's a lot. No, they've taken huge casualties. I mean, they're facing. It's sort of a race. It's a demographic race. So Ukraine, 44 million people. It's going through quite a few people. You look at Russia. Russia's 100 million. They've lost 2 million already in a year. With that rate, about 50 years there's going to be no one left. If of course the rate continues, but they've taken huge casualties, and that's why they're calling these people up. Is because they don't have enough people, and so they're just what they do is they've taken. So this military is very different to the Soviet military, where the Soviet military was largely just conscript, and it was just this huge force of just people. So the Russians still have a lot of their Soviet tanks. They have a huge stockpile of them, but they're largely in disrepair. So they got rid of the Soviet system, and now they have this sort of in-between system, which is sort of between a Western military and a Soviet military. And so they're feeding those conscripts into that military system.
Right.
So and it's really just a race to see who runs out of reserves, because of course you can only take so many people out of your population before it starts affecting your economy.
Yeah, and that's been a bit of my thinking of this whole thing is, let's say the casualties are 1-to-1, eventually Russia win. I know it's horrific, you're talking 1 million men dead, but eventually they win just from numbers. It's just, I'd hate to think that that's a case where that is how it ends up, but just the numbers it seems to say that.
Yeah, so war is attritional. War is based on, my brother's a mathematician, so war is based on mathematics. And the reality is that Russia can only sort of continue this war until there's sort of, their revenue collapses, right? So the Russian economy is sort of seizing up. So a lot of their export industries have disappeared. So really it's a sort of economic question for how long they can sort of keep and how much they're willing to sacrifice, lifestyle, cost of living to put into this war. If they're willing to, go through this war for a very long time, potentially that's the case. But it's also an issue you've also got to think of the amount of tanks. So Russia has lost over, I think looking at Oryx, over the amount that they began the war with. They're now going down to their T-60s. They're going down to tanks with no ERA on them. So at a certain point, they run out of equipment. So it kind of goes both ways. The Russians can also lose attritionally as well. But that said, we shouldn't have to fight an attritional war. The Ukrainians need maneuver. They need to be able to either seal off the border and defeat the Russians, as they did in Kherson, just seal off the main supply routes that way, and then just force the Russians out and freeze the conflict. Or they have to take centers of gravity, which are the two big cities, and march to the sea, cut off that land bridge, cut off the Crimean bridge, and by doing that, it doesn't really matter how many troops you have. In fact, if you have more troops, you lose your MSRs. it becomes worse.
Yes.
Because you can't redeploy them. So this is the concept. It's that the two concepts of maneuver versus attritional warfare. And unfortunately, Ukraine and Russia both struggle at maneuver, and the West hasn't been giving enough equipment. So yeah.
So if you're a betting man, by the end of the year, who do you think will be, I guess, victorious?
I think this will go on for, to be honest, like another couple of years. To be honest, like I don't think it will be over by this year.
Right.
Honestly, it's at this point, I'd say it's a 50-50 wager. I just can't, because there's so many things that Ukraine can still win. It is doable. We can win this war. It's just they need the kit, they need the equipment, they need as you said before, company, team, and battalion attacks are exceedingly complicated. And just taking people off the street, 80-year-olds, and throwing them into the meat grinder, as they literally call it. They literally call some of the guys literally call themselves meat, and it's despicable. Is not going to win this. We need to build up a core of professional Ukrainian soldiers, which there are. It's just that unfortunately a lot of them are being attrited. There's issues too. That's the other thing too. I have to quickly mention my medic I'm working with. Medevac in this country is virtually non-existent. So when someone becomes a casualty, generally we've been helping out getting better combat first aid. When they first started, they had no. They had eye packs, but they just had the Chinese tourniquets that would break. They didn't have chest seals. They didn't have they even have quick cloth in some cases. So which means you can't patch yourself up if you get gunshot wounds. And then once, if that's done properly, they get them into the back of the ambulance, and they'll generally, it's just an ambulance in many cases, if they can get them at all. Wagner's system is the Soviet system, which is where you get shot. You basically just go back to the rear and you're probably just going to die. But yeah, they get them out, and then basically the paramedics have to do miracles to try and keep them alive, and then they eventually get to a hospital. There's no helicopter evacuation. There's no golden hour. Right? There's no dust off. You don't do any of that. For reasons, obviously, landing helicopters is difficult. But even when they get to the hospital, a lot of the doctors and the equipment in these hospitals are dilapidated. They're giving medicines that give people ulcers that have been essentially banned in the West. Old Soviet medications and things. And there's issues with misdiagnosis. So even if you get to a hospital, which is very rare, the chance of your survival is very low. In many cases, you get shot, you die.
But I guess how? So, with us pumping $100 billion in, where is this going? Trauma medicine and tourniquets and all this should be very high on the list. This feeds into people's idea that there's just corruption that's being sold on.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you heard the other day, the defenseman. There is genuine corruption in this country, and the defense minister has been caught in that. There are actually aid organisations the Australian government works with that are actually pocketing the change. They're basically skimming off the top. They're delivering about 60% of it, and then selling the rest in the black market. The black market in this country is everywhere.
Right.
But there are groups like the ones I work with and other groups in this country who are making sure that it's getting to the right place. Unfortunately, we're not the ones getting any funding. We are literally getting what's keeping our lights on is literally small donations from parts of the Ukrainian diaspora. Right. We don't get anything from the Australian government, and the Australian government, when it does give stuff, it doesn't do it in a way that's accountable. And it comes back to that accountability question where there's no one making sure that that stuff's actually, like, there's no commander, there's no attaché in mood. I'd be happy to meet him. I'd be happy to send him to people, and he can go have a chat to the people on the front. And he can tell them, he can give a big press conference to them about how we've given X amount of aid to Ukraine or whatever, right? And they'll tell them, get fucked. But, you know, and the reality is there, but no one is being held accountable, and the Australian government or the So that's the problem. The other issue too is that for whatever reason, effectively my medic told me that I don't understand how. So the way it works, obviously, is, you know, in the West, if you get injured, you get stabilized, medevac by helicopter. It's the golden hour. They get you to, you know, the triage point, and then you're generally flown out to Ramstein, Germany.
Yeah.
Like, other than the guys who got injured in Mariupol, and what my medic said was effectively, unless you're a general, you don't go to a Western hospital. And I don't, in the short term, that's what we would desperately need. Is just, even just like civilian helicopters flying into safe areas and picking up people and stabilizing them. And of course, in addition to better equipment for guys at the front, better equipment, like that would be like world changing. Because at the moment, what we're doing is we're literally building, like we're trying to build stabilization points, because we've just got to try and keep them.
Yeah.
And that's all we can do. Is paramedics have to, you know, and we're trying to do things like do telehealth and link surgeons to paramedics, or like have, you know, get paramedics trained up on more surgical stuff. So like, yeah, look, we need to keep these guys alive, and we need to, like, because, you know, the more people we can like save, it's going to build morale, and it's going to be like, well, no, we're not going to let you just fucking you're not me, you're a fucking dick, and you're important to us, and you're fucking defending the free world. But that's not what's happening.
Yeah, that's it's disappointing, mate, that I think with the support is an illusion of there, and it's not. And I've seen it, I know it's on a lesser level than yourself, but when I'm out in the front areas in the east, I'm like, where the fuck is everyone? Where are these groups that have got millions of dollars? Where are these? You know, I rode along with a group who had $1.7 million in donations, and we delivered a handful of iodine tablets and a box of gloves, and I'm like, what the fuck? To these guys in the front with fucking nothing.
Yes.
And what pisses me off as well, it really fucking annoys me, is when you come in. Sorry, I'm unwell at the moment. When you come into Ukraine, you know, into the west from Poland, you can see the gear get worse and worse and worse the further east you go. The guys in the west standing on a checkpoint have new body armor, new helmets, new weapons, blah, blah, blah. And the further east you go, you know, the closer towards Russia, the closer towards the fighting, it's seemingly the worse the equipment gets. And it's just getting scavenged and not fed there. There's some guy, the best kitted soldiers I've seen are in Lviv with all the shit, who are still 1,000 kilometers or more from the Russian. And that goes back to that accountability of everything, accountability of the Ukrainians, accountability of the West, to make sure where it's going is meaning something. We probably could have donated half the money for the same effect if it was actually accountable.
Yeah, well, that's where, like, groups like mine sort of, we have to stay. And you're right, I've exact same experience. Guys in Kiev, they've got like brand new Spectre sights on their friggin' brand new, you know, AKs, and like, and they're all cops. Like, they're nowhere near the front. And like, we're going to the front. The guys have one set of cans. That's it. They have no knee pads. They've got a helmet that probably doesn't even fit properly. They don't even have helmet pads.
Yeah.
You know, like, and no MVG, no fucking, like, no proper IFACs. You know, that's changing, but, like, you know, like, it makes me so fucking angry to, like, see this shit and, like, you're seeing it in the casualty numbers. You're seeing it on the battlefield. It's translating.
Yeah.
Where these guys, and their morale is plummeting. And the reaction of the Ukrainian government. I don't know if you remember, like Bill A271.
No, sorry.
Bill A271 is a piece of legislation that makes it a criminal offence for you to criticise your commanding officer or even disagree with him in any way.
Yeah.
So there are guys, and they are literally saying, like, what the fuck are we, like, we do not have equipment, we do not have gear. And they're just like, well, we're just going to send you to jail for, it's not appealable. So if you get charged with this, you just go to jail.
That's insane.
It is utterly insane. And it came from, effectively there's like a fear within Ukrainian high command of effectively soldiers losing morale. It's a wider problem in Ukraine, and this gets into sort of Ukrainian politics, but yeah, it is exactly what you're saying, man, is and that's what we're seeing, you know, and
yeah. Oh, sorry to cut you off.
No, and we're seeing the same thing. That's what our group's saying. And we're trying to remedy it. We're trying to give them like what we can. We're trying to give them proper hearing pro and things like that, and helmets, mags and things like that. But we're just limited. It's just so hard. We're limited by money.
Yeah.
Like we're literally like whatever we can get. And look, the combat medic I'm working with, it's just, she's doing miracles. But yeah, there's only so much look, that's the Ukraine. You know, the training teams that are here, there are guys here training. There's some fucking clowns.
Yeah, of course.
There's just some absolute clowns from the West who've come here and just fucking done nothing
Western
or made
Savior
things
complex,
worse.
mate. They're fucking idiots.
Yeah.
I call them the fictional characters of Ukraine. That this was actually the missed opportunity for all us filmmakers and documentary producers in this war. The best documentary could have been is actually on these fictional characters. These fat dickheads from the West who did nothing, had no shit career, whatever, who have come there with a white Western Savior complex, and believe that their Navy SEALs are going to fix the war, get around in their fucking multicams and do absolutely nothing, if not worse.
Yeah, no, it's been a disaster because like, and this is where like, and again, to come back to the Australian government, like, if you're gonna have anyone enter the country, like at least fucking know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like we need, and like my group is doing stuff, but we're trying to make sure like we go for it, just like in the Australian Army, we have pre-deployment stuff. We train up on our TTPs. We get all our SOPs down. We know what the fuck we're doing. And then, you know, we go work with the guys. We train up the next level of trainers. You know, we even have guys who are looking to fully integrate into Ukrainian units and actually go out with them.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of, and again, it's all about what can we do for you. And unfortunately, there are people like that who do really good stuff. And then there's just absolute clowns. I ran into one like training team, and it was like there was like a father-son thing. Like there's no chain of command because they're all civilians, and it's like this is not helping. This is not helping.
They're for Instagram photos, mate.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and there's a lot of those guys too. Yeah, 100%. And that's it's unbelievable. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I as I said, I'm only here because I'm so angry at what's happening to these boys and girls. You know, they're just getting completely fucked. And it doesn't have to be this way. You know, we can fight a war that reduces, you know, casualties. You know, that can be, like, there's always going to be in war, but it doesn't have to be this unnecessary. Yeah. So, but anyway, yeah, that's effectively what's been happening.
Yeah. Well, mate, I think we've covered most stuff. Is there anything else you'd like to chat about before we sign off?
Yeah, I mean, other than just, you know, the reality of the front, like, just, you know, I've covered, I think, a lot of the stuff that's sort of still needs to be covered. We do need more assistance. These guys desperately need more support, and the situation is very dire. I told you before about the what happens when soldiers don't want to fight. They send them to an officer who generally have his pistol out and ask them why they don't want to fight anymore.
Right. And what would happen if you said, I just don't want to fight?
At best you'll be arrested and you'll go to jail 6 or 7 years, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And at worst?
It's what's that?
And at
worst
worst?
case, you get sent to a part of the front where you go die, basically, or they shoot you.
Yeah.
So it's been it's difficult because we cannot tell commanders what to do. They are in charge, and we have our hands tied.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the same as in Afghan, man. It's advise. You're an advisor. You advise. And it's like I can use all my tricks, tips to try and get people to I can advise them the best I can. But if they just don't listen, like, we have no power.
Yeah.
And I think, like, the Australian government, as I said, could definitely do a lot more. The Australian government has sent 40 trainers to the UK.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I know some of them, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that those guys are doing a bad thing, or
That's just not
we
enough,
shouldn't do that. It's not even close. No, and
my training team was to Afghan was 400.
Exactly, right? I mean, it's just 40s. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I can feel your frustration, mate.
Yeah, I know. It's just and you feel so helpless here because you're trying to make a difference, and like, we are trying literally everything, and yeah. It's, I know guys over here who've spent their whole super, they've spent everything in their pockets. I've obviously put a lot of money into this fight and trying to win here, and I've lost friends here, and I hope it changes.
Yeah, for sure, mate. I hope things get better for the best.
Hope so.
Well, mate, look, I just looked down at an hour and almost an hour and a quarter.
Yep.
Look, I really can't thank you enough, mate. And if at any time something pops up and you'd like to share whatever, the door's always open to come on and chat to me about this, as well as in person when I'm there in hopefully a couple of weeks.
Oh man, that'd be great. I have to obviously throw all of that stuff through my command, but yeah, no, absolutely appreciate the time you've given me to share these fellas' stories and what's actually happening, because I mean, all we can do is try and let the public know, like, this is what is the reality, and it's not just a bunch of press conferences don't win wars.
No, not at all. Well, mate, look, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I guess you're just starting your day there, so have a good day, mate.
Will do, mate. You look after yourself, mate. I'll be in touch.
Easy, brother. I'll speak to you soon.
Talk soon. See you, mate.
Bye.
Bye, mate.